Laurent Gbagbo was a history professor before he was ever a president. A man who lectured about freedom, democracy, and justice, and then spent his life trying to bring those ideas into Ivorian politics. He built his reputation as the teacher who challenged Côte d'Ivoire's one-party state, the intellectual who dared to say his country could be more. And then he got the chance to lead. But instead of becoming the solution, he became the problem. Under his watch, the nation slid into civil war. Thousands were killed, and his refusal to step down nearly tore Côte d'Ivoire apart. That is the paradox of Laurent Gbagbo, the man who fought for democracy but destroyed it when it meant giving up power. In this episode, we'll talk about Laurent Gbagbo and talk about his whole journey, from the Ivorian classroom to The Hague. Welcome to another episode of Afrinometry. Please kindly subscribe, share, and give this video a thumbs up. Laurent Gbagbo was born on May 31st, 1945, in Gagnoa, a town in central Côte d'Ivoire. He grew up in a modest Catholic family during the presidency of Félix Houphouët-Boigny, the man who ruled Côte d'Ivoire from independence in 1960 until his death in 1993. For most Ivorians, Houphouët-Boigny was simply the old man, a leader who delivered stability and growth, but also ruled with an iron grip. Under him, Côte d'Ivoire was officially a one-party state. Opposition was barely tolerated, and dissent was often crushed. Gbagbo chose a different path. He studied history at the University of Abidjan and later in Paris, earning his doctorate in African philosophy. By the 1970s, he was a lecturer at the École Normale Supérieure in Abidjan, but he wasn't just a professor. He was also a union activist, known for fiery speeches and an unshakable belief that Ivorians deserve more freedom. In 1971, he was arrested for the first time, accused of subversive teaching after criticizing Houphouët-Boigny's government. He spent months in detention, and that experience hardened him. Instead of silencing him, it transformed him into a full-blown opposition figure. By the mid-1970s, he had become a familiar name in intellectual and activist circles. In 1982, while in exile in Paris, he co-founded the Ivorian Popular Front, Front Populaire Ivoirienne, FPI, with Simon Eheved, who would later become his wife and political partner. The FPI was built around socialist and Pan-African ideas, directly challenging Houphouët-Boigny's conservative pro-Western policies. At a time when Côte d'Ivoire was seen as a darling of the West, stable, capitalist, and open for French investment, Gbagbo was attacking the system from outside. In 1983, Gbagbo published a book titled Côte d'Ivoire pour une alternité démocratique, Côte d'Ivoire pour a democratic alternative. In it, he argued that Houphouët-Boigny's single one-party state had created an illusion of stability while silencing true democracy. The book circulated on the ground, banned inside Côte d'Ivoire, but devoured by students and activists who wanted change. By the late 1980s, the one-party system itself was crumbling. Falling cocoa prices wrecked Ivorian economy, protests spread, and by 1990, Houphouët-Boigny reluctantly allowed multi-party politics. Gbagbo seized the moment. That year, he ran for president against Houphouët-Boigny in Côte d'Ivoire's first contested election. The results were lopsided. Houphouët-Boigny officially won with over 80% of the vote, but the election cemented Gbagbo's status as the face of the opposition. He was fiery, unafraid, and unlike many of his rivals, he was genuinely popular among students, workers, and the Christian South. Throughout the 1990s, Gbagbo continued to build his profile. After Houphouët-Boigny died in December 1993, the presidency went to Henry Konan Bedi. Under Bedi, the concept of Ivorite, Ivorianness took center stage. This policy was designed to exclude people of northern, often Muslim origin from full citizenship right. It was a political weapon aimed especially at Alassane Ouattara, Gbagbo's future rival, whose family background was tied to Burkina Faso. Gbagbo opposed Ivorite, at least in principle, but he also benefited from the way it split the political arena. While Ouattara was excluded, Gbagbo positioned himself as the only serious challenger to Bedi. In 1992, he was arrested again, this time for leading protests, and spent months in jail with his wife, Simone. That imprisonment only added to his image as an uncompromising opposition leader. Then came December 1999, Côte d'Ivoire first coup d'etat. Soldiers ousted Bedi and General Robert Gray took power. In the chaotic elections of October 2000, Ouattara was barred once again on Ivoire grounds. That left Gbagbo as the main civilian candidate against Robert. When Robert tried to declare himself winner despite losing, Ivorians flooded the street. Protesters marched, soldiers defected, and eventually Robert fled the capital. In October 2000, Laurent Gbagbo was sworn in as president of Côte d'Ivoire. After decades as a professor, activist, and opposition leader, he had finally taken power. For his supporters, it was the triumph of democracy. For his critics, it was the start of a new and uncertain chapter. When Laurent Gbagbo took power in October 2000, many Ivorians believed they were witnessing a new dawn. After 4 decades of one-party rule and years of military uncertainty, here was the man who had spent his life calling for democracy, finally in the presidential palace. They believed his presidency would be different and to deliver more than all the previous years. But almost immediately, his presidency was tested and then consumed by critics. In September 2002, just 2 years into his time, a mutiny erupted among northern soldiers who felt marginalized and excluded from power. The rebellion quickly escalated into a full-blown civil war. Within days, Côte d'Ivoire was split in two. The north, controlled by the rebel movement known as the Forces Nouvelles, dominated by northern Ivorians who had long felt excluded from politics. The south, controlled by Gbagbo's government and its loyal militias based in Abidjan and surrounding areas. The war exposed the deep divisions that had been festering since the 1990s. Religion, ethnicity, and the poisonous politics of Ivoire. The north, largely Muslim and tied to immigrant population from Burkina Faso and Mali, accused Gbagbo's government of treating them as foreigners in their own land. The south, largely Christian, rallied behind Gbagbo as the true defender of the nation. What followed was nearly a decade of instability and war. Peace agreements were signed in Marcoussis in 2003, Accra in 2004, Pretoria in 2005, but they were fragile, often breaking down before implementation. French peacekeepers and UN troops tried to hold the line between the two halves of the country, but violence simmered beneath the surface. Gbagbo's government, meanwhile, became more authoritarian. Loyalist militias such as the Young Patriot were unleashed on opponents. Human rights groups accused them of intimidation, violence, and even massacres. Propaganda on state television painted the rebels as foreign invaders, fueling ethnic hatred. At the same time, the economy, once the jewel of West Africa, collapsed. Cocoa export, Côte d'Ivoire's lifeblood, were disrupted by the fighting. Foreign investors fled. By 2004, the country's GDP had contracted. Poverty deepened, and ordinary Ivorians bore the brunt of the crisis. And yet, Gbagbo clung to power. His term, which was supposed to end in 2005, kept being extended under the excuse that elections couldn't be held during conflict. Year after year, the vote was delayed. To his supporters, this was necessary to protect stability. To his critics, it was proved that Gbagbo had no intention of ever leaving office. By the late 2000s, Côte d'Ivoire had become a powder keg. International pressure mounted for elections, and finally, in 2010, after 5 years of delay, presidential elections were scheduled. The hope was that democracy could heal the wounds of war. Instead, the election would push the country into its bloodiest chapter. By 2010, Côte d'Ivoire had already endured 8 years of division. The north was still under rebel control and the south was still under Gbagbo. The world was watching closely, hoping the long-delayed election would finally reunite the country. The first round of voting in October 2010 was historic. Millions turned out despite fears of violence. Laurent Gbagbo, the incumbent, came first with about 38% of the vote. His long-time rival, Alassane Ouattara, came second with 32% of the vote, while former president Henry Konan Bedi came third. That result set up a dramatic runoff. Gbagbo versus Ouattara, the very rivalry that had defined Ivorian politics for decades. The second round, held on November 28, 2010, was tense but largely peaceful at first. When the results were announced, the Independent Electoral Commission declared Ouattara the winner, with 54% of the vote against Gbagbo's 46%. International observers, including the UN, African Union, the European Union, certified the election as credible, but Gbagbo refused to accept defeat. He rejected the Commission's declaration and turned instead to the Constitutional Council, which annulled votes from several northern districts, effectively handing Gbagbo a narrow victory. Overnight, Côte d'Ivoire had two presidents, Ouattara recognized internationally, and Gbagbo entrenched in Abidjan. The standoff quickly spiraled into violence. Gbagbo forces clashed with Ouattara supporters who were backed by the former rebels, Forces Nouvelles. Massacres took place in towns like Doku, where hundreds of civilians were killed. Reports of torture, rape, and ethnic killings spread, which both sides implicated. The violence intensified through early 2011. By the time it ended, more than 3,000 people were dead, and hundreds of thousands had been displaced. The economy, already fragile, collapsed further. As international pressure mounted, French and UN troops intervened, backing Ouattara's forces at the advance in Abidjan. The climax came on April 11, 2011, when Ouattara's troops stormed Gbagbo's residence. Cameras captured the once defiant president being dragged out of a bunker with his wife Simone, disheveled but still refusing to acknowledge defeat. For many Ivorians, this was the ultimate tragedy. The man who once called himself the father of democracy had nearly destroyed the country by refusing to leave office. But Gbagbo's story did not end in Abidjan. His fall was only the beginning of a new chapter, one that will make history in an international courtroom. After his capture in April 2011, Laurent Gbagbo became the first former head of state ever to be transferred to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. It was a historic moment. Professor turned president, now facing charges of crimes against humanity. Charges were grave. Prosecutors accused him of orchestrating a campaign of violence to cling to power after losing the 2010 election. The crimes listed included murder, rape, persecution, and other inhuman acts, allegedly carried out by security forces and loyal militias during the post-election conflict. November 2011, Gbagbo was flown to the Netherlands and placed in ICC custody. The trial began in January 2016 and was closely watched across Africa. For his supporters, it was proof that France and the West conspired to remove a nationalist leader. They argued that Gbagbo was being scapegoated, while his rival, Alassane Ouattara, whose forces had also committed atrocities, remained untouched. For his critics, the trial was long overdue, a chance to hold accountable the man who refused to accept the will of the people and plunged Côte d'Ivoire into chaos. The trial itself revealed the complexity of Côte d'Ivoire's crisis. Witnesses described massacres, sexual violence, and the use of militias to terrorize civilians. But the case was plagued by weak evidence and unreliable testimony. After years of proceedings, the ICC concluded that the prosecutors had failed to prove Gbagbo's direct responsibility. On January 15, 2019, Laurent Gbagbo was acquitted of all charges. The decision was upheld on appeal in March 2021. For his supporters, the acquittal was vindication. They celebrated him as a survivor, a leader who had stood up to international powers and walked free. For others, it was a bitter pill, a reminder that justice for the thousands killed in the 2010-2011 conflict remained elusive. Gbagbo spent nearly a decade in exile before finally returning home in June 2021. Tens of thousands of people lined the streets of Abidjan to welcome him back. The man once dragged from a bunker had come back to a hero's reception. Côte d'Ivoire was no longer the country he had left. Ouattara was firmly in power, the economy was booming, and a new generation of Ivorians was too young to remember the days when Gbagbo has been seen as a champion of democracy. Still, his return reopened old wounds and revived the debate about who Laurent Gbagbo really was: a freedom fighter, a nationalist betrayed by France, or a power-hungry autocrat who sacrificed his country to remain president. Laurent Gbagbo's story is one of the great paradoxes of modern Africa. He began as a professor who preached freedom, democracy, and progress in the lecture halls of Abidjan. He built his reputation as a stubborn opposition leader who defied Felix Houphouët-Boigny, Henry Konan Bedie, and the one-party state. He endured arrest, exile, and harassment to fight for multi-party politics. And in 2000, when he finally became president, it seemed like history had rewarded his persistence. But the promise of Gbagbo's presidency quickly collapsed into division and war. His refusal to compromise with his rivals, his reliance on militias, and his resistance to electoral defeat all turned him into the very thing he once proposed: a leader who had clung to power at the cost of his country. Domestically, he's remembered in two very different ways. To his base, he's still the woody, tough one, the grassroots fighter who resisted France and global powers, a man who gave his voice to ordinary Ivorians who felt excluded. To his opponent, he's the man who plunged Côte d'Ivoire into civil war, left 3,000 people dead after the 2010 election, and nearly destroyed democracy in the name of saving it. Internationally, his legacy is just as divided. His trial at the ICC marked him as the first head of state to be judged for crimes against humanity. Though acquitted, he remains a symbol of how fragile democracy can be when leaders refuse to step down. And so, the paradox endures. Was Laurent Gbagbo a democrat betrayed or an autocrat exposed? Was he the historian who understood freedom or the politician who could never practice what he thought? The answer depends on who you ask. But one truth remains. In the history of Côte d'Ivoire, Laurent Gbagbo will always be remembered not just for the battles he fought, but for the battles his country endured because he refused to leave the stage. Thank you for watching this episode. Share this with someone, and until I see you again, bye bye.